Is this the full-spec Perodua Traz that we've been waiting for? Now, under the bonnet, the Toyota Yaris Cross uses the same powertrain that you get from the Perodua Traz, which means that you get a 1.5-litre naturally aspirated 4-cylinder, which produces about 105 PS and 138 Newton meters of torque. That power goes to the front wheels via a DCVT automatic gearbox. Now, the thing about the Yaris Cross is that this can also be had as a hybrid, but we're not going to talk about that because this isn't the hybrid, and if I do, then they won't lend me one. Now, the thing about the Yaris Cross is that more than anything else, this is a significantly more expensive model. This car starts at about 100,000 ringgit, which makes it 20,000 ringgit more than a Perodua Traz, which means that you are looking at this thinking, where is my money really going? Now, in order to help soften the blow somewhat, at least the Yaris Cross does look very different. So while you still get the same full LED headlights replete with automatic high beam as well as LED indicators, as well as LED fog lights down here, the fascia has been significantly reworked compared to that of the Perodua Traz. So for example, you get a much larger hexagonal downturn grille here, which is something that is shared with other Toyota models like the Veloz as well as the Corolla Cross. You also get different sort of side treatments here which help to make the car look a little bit wider, and I do think the front end of the Yaris Cross does look a little bit neater and a little bit more put together compared to that of the Perodua. Now, one thing that I would like to point out is the fact that with this car you also get this sort of mesh grille design, again like what we've seen from other Toyota models, and you get this very prominent sort of lower bash plate contrast paneling down there in order to make this car look a little bit more aggressive. Now, as far as I'm concerned, I do think that the Yaris Cross and by extension the Perodua Traz are actually relatively good-looking cars. However, I do think that this front end does make this car look a little bit more upmarket, and so I think that that goes some way to soften that 20,000 ringgit blow. Now, down the side, the biggest difference on the Yaris Cross compared to the Perodua is the rolling stock. This car rides on 18-inch alloy wheels wrapped in Toyo Proxys R61 wheels. Now, in terms of the design, they are slightly simpler compared to the slightly more flowery pattern that you get on the Perodua Traz, and I do think that it does help to make the car look a little bit more handsome. On top of that, because this car has a dual-tone alloy wheel finish, plus it is an inch larger, it does seem to fit the arches a little bit better on this car compared to what we saw on the Perodua. Now, despite that, the rest of the car looks very familiar, which means that you do get a set of functional roof rails finished in silver. You get some contrasting down on the bottom to help sort of visually pinch the car a little bit. But in terms of the metalwork, it is broadly identical to that of the national car. And as far as I'm concerned, I do think that this is generally an all-right looking side profile. I think this car does look relatively handsome. Now, on this point, I'd like to touch a little bit on dimensions. Now, this car does compete directly with vehicles like the Honda HR-V, as well as obviously the Perodua and other vehicles in the B-segment crossover space. Now, compared to the Honda HR-V, the Traz actually has a 10mm longer wheelbase compared to that of the Honda. And so that does pay dividends when it comes to cabin space, but we'll touch on that a little bit later. More importantly, because this car is a little bit longer, it does mean that, as you can see here, there is plenty of theoretical space in the boot. Now, the back end of the Yaris Cross is also a very familiar sight. You just have slightly different bumpers here, but aside from that, everything back here is still exactly the same. So you get full LED tail lights, replete with LED indicators, non-scrolling. You also get this sort of rear spoiler here, which I think does look quite nice. And of course, you get a rear windscreen wiper there. Now, as far as I'm concerned, I do think that, once again, the overall design of the Yaris Cross is quite handsome. I like how shapely it is, and I do appreciate the fact that these tail lights actually remind me very much of the units that you get on a Lexus. Now, one feature that the Yaris Cross offers, that the Perodua Traz also offers, that other vehicles with the space do not, is a keyless boot. Now, of course, this is powered, much like many other vehicles. However, if you swing your foot underneath the bumper like that, eventually the the boot will open. This literally just worked a second ago. There we go. So eventually, once you're done waggling your foot underneath the car for about 30 minutes, the boot does open. Now, talking about this tailgate, this is a huge expanse of space. The amount of room in here is some 100 liters larger than what you get from a Perodua Attiva, and it is significantly larger than what you get from even a Proton X50, among many others. The Yaris Cross is by far and away the largest boot capacity vehicle within this space. On top of that, because this is a Toyota, naturally there are a bunch of accessories that you can get with this car, including this sort of plastic boot protector liner thing, which means that anything that you put in here is not going to mess up your carpet and make the car look dirty. Now, underneath this, you will actually find a pretty decent amount of space. You can actually lower the boot floor significantly in order to improve vertical space, but if you leave it in its higher setting, that you get no load lip. There is a space saver spare wheel underneath the boot floor because UMW Toyota is learning from their mistakes with the Toyota Vios. And of course, with the boot set at its highest floor position, the rear seats can be folded 60-40 completely flat, which means that if you do need more space to carry things in your Yaris Cross, it is happy to accommodate. One of the things about this car, however, in this particular guise that I'm not a big fan of, is the fact that a lot of Toyotas come with this, which is the emergency kit. Now, I'm not entirely sure what's in it because I've never had to use it. However, because this is, just a canvas bag and then you have a plastic boot protector, it does mean that every time you take a corner, it sort of slides around. Not great. And this will also not really fit underneath the boot floor if you put it on its lowest setting. And even if you put it like this, underneath the boot floor in its higher setting, it's still going to roll around. I just feel like if they put some Velcro on the back of this, which it does seem to have, it could stick to the backs of the seats a little bit better rather than just sort of slide around. So if you buy one of these, be sure to remove it from the plastic cover, which I'm not going to because it's not my car, and then fix it to the back of the seats. Otherwise, it is going to make a racket. Now, the interior of the Yaris Cross sees some big changes because now this is done in blue, where it used to be red. No, actually, there are some seriously large changes in here. Firstly, while this car retains the same climate control system that we also saw in the Perodua Traz, there are some updates to the screens. So, for example, the central infotainment screen is now significantly larger than what you get from Perodua, but that now presents its own problem because it actually limits visibility off of that corner. So, for example, if there is a vehicle on the left lane that happens to be just a bit ahead of you, this does a pretty good job of obscuring where the corner of your Yaris Cross is. So that's nice. The instrument cluster is now also digital compared to the dual dials that you get from the Perodua, but perhaps the biggest change in here is this, because now on this spoke there are buttons, and this controls the car's active safety systems such as things like the adaptive cruise control, the follow distance, etc. All of that now lives on the right spoke, which now makes this look significantly less empty compared to what you got from the Perodua. The other thing that's also different is the fact that these seats are now not only leather upholstered with more blue stitching in order to match the detailing that you get on the dash, but the driver's seat is also powered as standard, which means that as I'm sat here, I can go up and down and forwards and backwards. That's all quite nice, although it is slightly unfortunate that I still don't get lumbar support in this car, but that is that. Now, speaking of the steering wheel itself, in addition to this being quite adjustable, because of course you can move it in and out as well as up and down and get it to a nice comfortable position, the other benefit is that this leather-wrapped steering wheel now also comes with paddle shifters in order to manipulate this car's DCVT automatic gearbox. Although, to be honest, over the last week or so I've been driving this car around, I haven't used these at all, and the DCVT does seem to feel like a DCVT from Daihatsu rather than a CVT unit from Toyota. The difference being that the Daihatsu unit has a fixed final gear for its highest ratio, whereas the Toyota units have a fixed first gear for better takeoff. Yeah. Anyway, moving beyond that, we also get a little bit of space here. You get a wireless phone charger here, a couple of cup holders which are deployable, which means that you can fold them out of the way in order to make a nice deep well. You get your electronic parking brake here, as well as a rather shallow center console which hides only the 12-volt socket. Now, in terms of other amenities, one of the things that I have realized has been quite irritating is the fact that there's only a single USB port in the front half of this cabin, and that lives here. That's a USB-A port, which is quite slow. There are no other USB ports in here, just the 12-volt socket in the center armrest that I mentioned earlier, which I think is quite unfortunate. But the Yaris Cross does claw some points back by offering ambient lighting. Although it's only in blue and only here in the center console above the wireless charging tray, as well as on the door cards themselves, which sort of bleed over this fluted edge. But aside from that, this interior does feel pretty decent for 100 grand. Yes, the dash is a hard touch material, but the door cards are nice and soft, and while there is some shiny black plastic along the doors, it doesn't feel overly offensive because this isn't going to be a panel that you'll touch very often. But the armrests themselves are quite soft. The steering wheel, like I said earlier, is leather wrapped, and it feels like it's going to be a nice sort of well-wearing sort of thing. And so overall, I do quite like the way this interior has been laid out. The only problem is when you start looking at the details, that's where this car starts to fall a little bit flat. For example, for 100,000 ringgit, I would have expected a dimming rear view mirror, although that might just be me being a bit much. Though I do think that my gripes are fully justified because, like in the Perodua Traz, the dashboard sort of here, kind of where your eye line goes next to this infotainment system, is not particularly well made, because there's one panel up here and then one panel here for sort of the front of the dash, which meets another panel that lives on this side, which stretches all the way to the other side of the dash. Where these three panels meet, they don't quite meet very neatly, and so there's a point here. But more annoyingly, this larger panel back here seems to be misaligned, which means that there is a nice gap sort of back there, and I can actually see the seam where it's supposed to tuck in underneath the furthest part of the dash, which I think is quite unfortunate. What that has also revealed, because I've been reaching all the way up here, is the fact that this car has no front defogger, which I think is very strange. I think the Japanese are sort of moving towards removing defoggers altogether, because the Perodua Axia, if I recall correctly, does not have a rear defogger for the rear windscreen, and now the Yaris Cross has no defogger for the front. That is an interesting choice. Now, aside from that, I would also like to point out the fact that there are a set of buttons on the right side, kind of where my right knee is, which helps control things like this car's power tailgate, as well as your active safety features, your parking sensors all the way around, as well as your TPMS system, as well as the automatic high beam. However, one of the things I'd like to point out is the fact there are two blank buttons on this side. I'm going to assume that these buttons or these blank spaces are utilized for the hybrid model, for EV mode or something, because the drive modes are actually controlled via the steering wheel, or in fact by putting the gearbox into sport mode or manual mode if you should so want to. But what I find odd is the fact that there is no button for this car's PVM, or panoramic view monitor, which is something that Toyota makes a lot of noise about. The reason I say this is because there have been a couple of instances where I've wanted the 360 cam to come on, and then it just hasn't, because there's no button on the steering wheel, there's no button in the center console, there's no button to my right. You just sort of have to go into this and then find it, which is in apps and then PVM. This is particularly annoying when you have this set to your Android Auto, because it takes up the entirety of the screen, as you can see here, and then in order to get to the PVM, you have to press home, and it takes a second to respond. Then you have to go to apps and then PVM. Now imagine trying to do that when you're parking, or trying to do that as you're going through a particularly narrow street. I find that just unnecessarily irritating. The other thing that's unnecessarily irritating is the fact that the overall system here, it's a bit laggy. Your Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, which is again wireless, that does seem to respond well enough, but it feels like all of the built-in stuff is just a bit janky. And I would have much rather that they spent a bit more money on a slightly higher sort of resolution or higher powered center console unit that would be a bit more responsive, rather than spending money on ensuring that the vehicle in the image says Yaris Cross on the front and rear number plates. That just feels like very, very strange prioritizing. Now, the back of the Yaris Cross actually reveals this car's party piece, which is its size, because even though this interior does feel quite dark, because Malaysians insist on full black interiors, there is plenty of space. The front seats are in my driving position, about 170 centimeters. I have acres of knee room and a pretty good amount of headroom at that, about that much, in fact, which I think is pretty good going. Furthermore, the foot space in this car has really been maximized, which means I have plenty of space to tuck my feet in underneath the seat in front of me, and even if there were a third passenger here in the middle, there is plenty of space for their feet to straddle the central sort of transmission tunnel on this car, which means that overall life is pretty good. Now, because the Yaris Cross is actually quite wide, it does mean that, for example, fitting 3 adults back here would be significantly more comfortable compared to something like a Perodua Ativa, or in fact quite a number of other vehicles within the B segment. Moreover, I do think that the back end of this car actually feels a bit more capacious than what you get from a Proton X50, which I think is, again, pretty good going. Now, in terms of other amenities, you get bottle holders here in the doors, which are big enough for a litre size bottle, whereas the ones in the front were big enough for a litre-and-a-half size bottle. I get a set of USB-C ports at the bottom of the center console, which is nice, although they are very far down, which means that actually, if you're not looking for them, it'd be quite hard to spot. There are a set of crotch coolers, which I say with pride because they are actually mounted lower than where my knees are. And you do get a deployable center armrest here, which, unlike in other Toyotas, actually folds to a nice angle compared to, for example, on the Corolla, where it just sort of flops down and then rests on the base of the seat, which I think is quite nice. And of course, there are a couple of cup holders here. One of the things I do appreciate about the back of the Yaris Cross is the fact that, number one, I actually have angle adjustment for my backrest, which means that I can sit more reclined like this, or I can sit a bit more upright like this. Secondly, the engineers at Toyota have figured out a way to mount this seat in the second row a bit higher than the ones in the front, which means that as I'm sat here, I can actually see over the shoulders of the driver ahead of me, which affords me a pretty good view all the way around. And just like the front, the materials in the back are actually just as good as they are in the front. So for example, this is all soft touch. This is also soft touch here, with only this panel here being a bit scratchy. And unfortunately, there is no ambient lighting on this panel, but you know, it's $100,000. More importantly, because this car has a relatively long wheelbase and these doors do open quite wide, it does mean that fitting a bulky rear-facing child seat should not be too much of a palaver in the back of this car. Although that said, it would have been nice if the Yaris Cross offered the ability to disable the front passenger airbag and then offer an ISOFIX mount on the front seat, because that would have offered a bit more versatility, especially again for those bulky rear-facing child seats. But overall, I do think that this is a pretty practical, pretty decent car. I can understand why it is that Toyota feels that this car should be relatively popular among young families with young children, for example, or in fact empty nesters who want a car that feels and looks a bit more sophisticated in order to communicate their upward mobility. This is pretty good. Now let's see if that extends into the driving experience, because Toyota claims that this car has been improved over the Perodua. Now, many claims have been made by Toyota that many refinements have been made in order to make the Yaris Cross feel like a more upmarket product, and I've no doubt which vehicle they used as a benchmark. Now, from the surface, as you drive this car along, etc., it's not immediately obvious to you where those refinements have been made. Because, for example, if you're just driving around at urban speeds, this car feels just as nice as the Perodua Traz does. It's very quiet, it's relatively comfortable, the suspension feels very well sort of managed and well judged, and so overall it does just feel like a pretty good place to be, which it is. And the thing is, it's not until you start to get sort of a little bit of a move on do you realize where the differences lie. For example, one turn of the steering wheel and you realize that actually the steering in this car is slightly heavier than what you get from the Perodua. Now, of course, both cars use electric power-assisted steering systems, which means that in all seriousness, this is probably just a small refinement change thing. But because of that change in terms of the way it's been geared and the way it feels, it does make the car feel a little bit different compared to the Perodua. Helps go some way to justify that 20,000 ringgit premium. Now, in terms of ride and handling of this car, it does feel broadly similar to what you get from the Perodua Traz, which means that the suspension, for example, is very well judged. It's not too soft to the point where the car feels disconnected from the world around it, but it's also not too stiff in order to improve body control, but then compromise interior comfort. It just feels, again, just very well judged. It doesn't feel too stiff, it doesn't feel too soft, and instead it just delivers a ride that's pretty good at isolating the worst of the lumps and bumps. So for example, at urban speeds, potholes and stuff like that do not feel overly jarring into the cabin, but it's not so soft that when you're on the motorway, for example, it feels ponderous and wayward. Instead, it just feels, again, very well sorted. This is a sort of car that you'd enjoy driving in town because, again, it sort of smooths out the very worst imperfections of the road while not compromising too much in terms of overall drivability, which means that if you were to cover long distances in this car, you'll appreciate the fact that it feels very connected, it feels like it's communicating back to the driver, and it just feels very confident on the motorway at motorway speeds, and it feels very comfortable to drive in town. The other area where you can tell that Toyota has spent some degree of time and effort towards refining this vehicle is actually in terms of overall refinement, NVH levels, because it does feel like the Yaris Cross has a little bit more sound insulation from sort of where the firewall is in order to remove excess noise from the engine room into the cabin, which means that when you're driving this car around, even at relatively heavy throttle input, it does seem to feel as if this car is a little bit quieter by a few measurable, noticeable decibels compared to the Perodua. It's a small change, but it is something that you will notice and over time you will come to appreciate. And so again, all of this does go some way towards justifying that 20,000 ringgit price premium, because again, that's not a small number, and so needs to do many more things in order to justify that big expense. 20,000 ringgit difference over a 9-year loan works up to about 200 to 300 bucks a month, which means it's a big deal. Now, one of the things that you will come to appreciate about the Yaris Cross is that this car has been very clearly tailored and geared towards town driving, which means that as you drive this car around, you appreciate the fact that you have very good visibility and that all the controls seem to be geared towards making urban driving feel a little bit easier, a little bit more sensible, and it just makes everything feel like a bit of a doddle. Although to be fair, this is actually a trait that is shared with the Perodua Traz, which means that this isn't a way this car justifies its 20,000 ringgit price premium. When you hit the motorway, however, that's where again you feel that little sense of a difference, because this car does feel a little bit quieter. The Toyota Proxys tires, for example, do not kick up nearly as much road roar as the ones that you get on the Perodua Traz. I'm not entirely sure why, because if I'm not mistaken, they use identical rubber. But for whatever reason, in this car, it just feels a little bit quieter. Like you can tell that it's a little bit quieter. And in terms of wind noise, well, it's just as good as it was in the Perodua, which means that there is nothing really to complain about. The Perodua Traz was undoubtedly one of the most refined Peroduas ever made, and this Yaris Cross is just as refined. So that's overall a good thing. But once you hit the motorway, you start to cover distance, cover miles, that's when you will appreciate the other differentiating factor in this car. Now, the seats, as I mentioned earlier, are just as comfortable as they are in the Perodua. The designs of them remain exactly the same, although obviously in the Yaris Cross they are powered, whereas in the Perodua they are manual. But that's not the point I'm trying to make. The point I'm trying to make here is actually in terms of this car's active safety features. Now, you may ask why it is I bring this up in terms of its long, or rather high speed or long distance comfort. And I say this because active safety features, especially things like adaptive cruise control, etc., really go a long way towards making the overall cabin experience feel a little bit more comfortable, because the car is taking away the majority of the strain of driving. And the ADAS systems in this car, when you're driving long distance specifically, is actually not that bad, because the system does seem to react well enough. This Yaris Cross uses the same vision-based stereo camera system that you get from Perodua models, not a radar-guided system that you get from higher-end models like the Corolla Cross. And so there are some foibles with this system. The camera does do a pretty good job at picking up whatever it is that might be ahead of it in terms of judging distance, etc. It does all that pretty well. However, what it doesn't do that well is in terms of being able to manage itself through traffic jams. So one of the things I've come to realize about this sort of stereo camera system is that it seems to be very jumpy. So when the car in front sort of moves around, if a car suddenly cuts you off, or if it suddenly sort of accelerates and powers away from you, you will realize that the whole system just sort of acts in a very unrefined manner. It will either slam on the brakes or it'll jump on the throttle, and it sort of powers its way through things. It just feels a little bit janky and not quite as refined as you might necessarily want. And the reason why this is a particular problem with this car is because of that DCVT gearbox. So if you are gentle with the throttle, if you're gentle with the inputs with this car, it does feel very refined and the powertrain does feel pretty well resolved. However, if you are not particularly smooth with the control inputs, that's when this car starts to get a bit loud. So as I will demonstrate now, leaving the toll plaza on a gentle throttle input, the car is very smooth, it's very quiet, it's very refined. However, if I were to pin the throttle a little bit, camera angle changing, you will realize that the engine does sort of make itself quite vocal. And this 1.5 liter 4-cylinder is not the most refined powertrain in the world, which means that when it makes itself heard, it's going to make itself heard. Now, That's not necessarily a bad thing as a whole, because this engine is relatively reliable, it's relatively smooth in its operation. The sound may suggest something else, but in operation, it does feel relatively smooth. However, it's just one of those things that you have to bear in mind. This car is not without its foibles. As I mentioned, the ADAS is a little bit janky, and that engine, if you were to get on it and slam on the accelerator, you're going to hear it. It's going to make itself known and heard to you as you go about your business. But again, as I've said before, I do not see this as major detractions, because I think the Yaris Cross as a whole is a pretty solid performer. As I sit here on the motorway doing 90 kilometers an hour, because it's the NKVE and that's what the speed limit is, by the way, it just feels pretty alright. I'd be quite comfortable to do distance in this car at this speed if I'm just commuting from home to work and back again. I think this would be perfectly acceptable. It's just that, again, the engine is not as quiet as you might want, the ADAS is not as refined as you might want, and the sound system in this car is quite cack. But beyond that, it's alright. I think that for 100,000 ringgit, this is a pretty good deal. You're getting a very large, very practical car, perfectly suitable for small families or families with young children. You've got plenty of boot space, the suspension feels really well resolved. It's just nice. Now overall, the Yaris Cross, again, just feels like a very well-resolved vehicle. It feels like it's a vehicle that's very well engineered, very well thought of, and it just feels like the sort of thing that you'd be very happy to live with over a longer term basis. I can't imagine that people would be unhappy to live with something like a Yaris Cross over the longer term. Fuel consumption has also been pretty good, averaging about 13 to 14 kilometers per litre during our testing, although the numbers that you see on the screen may not necessarily display that because the car's been idling as we shoot. But it just feels pretty good. However, I have a theory. I think that the Yaris Cross, as it stands, is a pretty good car. If you want something with, a full ADAS suite, whatever, you'd be happy in this car for 10, 15, 20 years for that matter. However, I think that this is not the best Yaris Cross that money can buy, because this car is available as a hybrid. And as I've discovered in the Vios hybrid, the latest generation of hybrid systems in compact Toyotas are very impressive. Which means that it just feels like this car is, again, pretty well resolved, but it could be a bit better. It could be a bit better solely on the basis that a better option exists. And I do feel that the hybrid system in this car would be a slightly better option. Furthermore, given the fact that this car will be spending most of its life as an urban crawler, the sort of car that will be driving you to work and picking up the kids from school and doing sort of the usual errand runs and stuff like that, it just feels like a hybrid powertrain would be a better match for this car. In addition to that, because the electrified powertrain from Toyota is a pretty heady, pretty impressive affair, it should also mean that because of the electric assistance, you should hear the engine less, because during high torque demand situations, you can rely on that electric motor to provide the necessary torque, the necessary twist that you might be looking for in that particular scenario. And so, do I think the Yaris Cross is a good car? Again, for the money, I think it is. And as far as I'm concerned, it does feel like the sort of package that people will be happy to live with over a longer term. However, if you can stretch, I think it's an additional 10,000 ringgit for the hybrid powertrain, I think you'd be much happier in that, because I feel like this entire package of a vehicle would just work better with an electrified powertrain that would not only provide a little bit more immediacy in terms of its torque delivery, but also with improved fuel consumption. In fact, there are some owners that are reporting 24, 25 kilometers to the litre, which I think is very, very impressive for a vehicle of this size. However, if you are the sort of person on the market for a B-segment crossover, where you actually do a lot of motorway distance on a regular basis, like say if you're a traveling salesman type, or I don't know, you really like your in-laws that live 3 states away, then perhaps the Proton X50 might be a slightly better bet, because although that car has a slightly smaller boot and the interior might not be quite as large or as capacious as the Yaris Cross or indeed the Perodua Traz, because of that powertrain, the car will feel like it's got a little bit more, it feels a bit more gutsy, as it were, which means that as you drive that car along and go about your business, etc., it will just feel like a slightly better sort of package overall, I feel. But if you want a vehicle within this segment that is better to drive, honestly, just wait for the eventual Yaris Cross GR Sport. To be fair, I do think that this is a pretty decent car to drive as it stands, but the fact that this powertrain, or rather this platform, I know can be exploited a little bit further with the sort of little sprinkling of pixie dust that you get from a GR Sport model. That, to me, feels very exciting. I'd be very excited to drive a Yaris Cross Hybrid GR Sport, because I feel like that would be sort of the furthest reaches, the maximum capability that this car has to offer. And besides, in the B segment crossover space, do you really need a car that drives that well? But in any case, that concludes our review of the 2026 Toyota Yaris Cross S non-hybrid. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon to notify every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the description below, including the link to join our new WhatsApp channel. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.